Welcome from Copenhagen and from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And thank you very much for prioritizing to attend this event. I know it's a busy week and with many side events of the high-level political forum in general. So thanks for that. My name is Claus Larsen. I'm the acting Deputy Executive Director at the International Division in the Danish Institute for Human Rights. So I'm facilitating this discussion. Before we start, it's become good practice with a few housekeeping points because they tend to vary a little bit from webinar to webinar. The first one is please turn off your camera and mute your microphone when you're not on the panel. Please know that we will be recording the event and share the recording and some resources after the event. In relation to the chat, you are welcome to use it throughout the side event for sort of internal communication that you might have, but it will only be monitored from our side during the Q&A session at the end, where we hope to have a little more interactive session if time allows. Then it's important to know that we have both English and Spanish speakers today. So to access interpretation to English, Spanish, French, please follow the instructions that have been given in the chat. So that's it. We have 90 minutes ahead of us. We know we could talk for much more than that. So please be mindful of time with your interventions, and I will be too in my interventions, and I will try to drive it forward so that we end the session in, I can see, 88 minutes from now. Welcome, and let me start with a few comments to start with. With the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, which was launched in 2021, 48 state signatories and 28 supporting organizations recognized the devastating impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on our economies and societies, and the negative impacts on the enjoyment of human rights and progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The purpose of this pledge was to express determination to build back better from the pandemic, placing human rights at the heart of response and recovery efforts, and using the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement as a blueprint. The pledge consists of 10 action points and a commitment to report on progress and to renew the social contract, such as universal health coverage and vaccine equity, participatory governance practices and service delivery mechanisms that reduce inequality, and the urgent need for a green transition to halt runaway climate change. Now, with this event, it is time to discuss what member states, the UN, and civil society representatives have been doing to place human rights and those left behind at the center of their work. It is time, in other words, to check whether we are preparing for future crises and making risk-informed strategies in a more sustainable, just, and resilient way. We will hear from the panel from the members of the panels, what lessons they have learned from the recovery efforts and which good practices they can share to inspire others. So before the actual program commences, or in the beginning of it, the opening remarks will be provided by the permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations, His Excellency Ambassador Martin Bille Hermann, and the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Brands-Keris. In a few seconds, we will hear from His Excellency Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Denmark to the United Nations, Mr. Martin Bille Hermann. The floor is yours, Martin.
Thanks, Claus. Please don't call me Excellency. You know, I don't respond. Anyway, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining, no matter where in the world you might be. I'd like to welcome you all very, very warmly to this discussion, and especially welcome, of course, to our distinguished panelists to this side event that takes place on the occasion of the high-level political forum this year. Now, just a few remarks from my side. First, I think really important to note that in 2022, for the second year in a row, progress on achieving the SDGs has halted or reversed. We are not only off track, we are backsliding. And as we've heard I think time and time again, the pandemic has exacerbating existing inequalities, vulnerabilities, and has heightened discrimination. It's made things worse. Let me just highlight three areas. First of all, I think the pandemic has led to a major setback for women's rights and gender equality globally. Unpaid care work, just to give one example, has exponentially increased, as has gender-based violence. Second, civic space is under increasing pressure across the world. 9 out of 10 people live in countries where civic freedoms are restricted. That's simply not good enough. And third, globally, 4 billion people are still without any form of social protection, and they have felt the full force of the pandemic without any assistance. Now, as we embark on the road to recovery, we really need to seize the opportunity to not only accelerate, but actually redouble our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and realize that we need to do that with human rights at the very heart. So, it's been said so many times, and it's banal, but it's also very right. Recovery is an opportunity to build back better, as Klaus said. It's an opportunity to address the discrimination, the injustice, and inequality that the pandemic has not only shed a spotlight on, but as I said, actually made worse. It's an opportunity to promote democratic principles and good governance at all levels. It's an opportunity to ensure effective and meaningful civil society participation. It's a necessity and opportunity to protect the space for journalists and human rights defenders, and to empower and engage all women and girls, and I think especially those that find themselves in vulnerable positions. Make them agents of change, empower them to make a difference. Now, as Klaus mentioned, as you will know, in 2021, in connection with the 47th session of the Human Rights Council in Denmark, and I think important to note here, together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Universal Rights Group launched the Sustainable Recovery Pledge to try to ensure that human rights and sustainable development are seen as integral parts and at the core of the 2019 recovery strategies. As Klaus mentioned, 48 states, I think important to note, also 29 organizations have signed on in support of the pledge. And now our colleagues in Geneva have passed the baton to us here in New York to continue this conversation during the high-level political forum. And I think this is an excellent opportunity, because one of the key purposes of the high-level political forum is actually for stakeholders to listen and learn from the first-hand experience of others on what works and what doesn't, as we all strive to realize the 2030 agenda and achieve the SDGs. And that's exactly what we seek to do today. So we'll hear from our panelists today that represents both member states, civil society, and the UN system on what sustainable, just, and resilient recovery actually looks like in practice. Finally, I just want to extend also a warm thank you to the Danish Institute for Human Rights for carrying the torch for all the work that you've done in highlighting not only the close links between human rights and sustainable development goals, but actually that they are integral to each other. One is simply not possible without the other. And also to the Universal Rights Group for all the work that you do, also that you're doing in connection with this event. And then finally, of course, to the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, my good friend Ilse, for joining us and delivering opening remarks, but actually, Ilse, more importantly, for the work that you, but also all your colleagues do around the world, carrying the torch of human rights, reminding us that ultimately this is what it's all about. It's all about we the peoples at the end. So I wish all of you fruitful discussions. Listen and learn, inspire each other. And with that, Klaus, back to you. And thanks for giving me this.
Thank you very much, Martin, for a first and foremost very honest assessment of the situation, which also I think is very focusing for an honest discussion as well when it comes to the subsequent speakers. For another set of opening remarks, over to the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Brands-Keris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you, Martin. Always good to go hand in hand with you. Good morning and good afternoon, dear Excellencies, colleagues and friends, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, even if it's quite early in New York, but certainly we're very well motivated to join in this important discussion. So I would like to thank, of course, the organizers, the Permanent Mission of Denmark, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and the Universal Rights Group. So the world continues to struggle with the impact of the pandemic, but we also know that there's a global food, fuel, and finance crisis, and that together risks plunging millions more into food insecurity and poverty. The World Food Programme estimates that the number of severely food insecure people will grow by over 40 million to 323 million people this year alone. Marginalized groups, as we know, and we have talked a lot about that during the COVID pandemic, such as minority communities, poor, indigenous peoples, and informal sector workers, will bear the brunt of the burden. In this context, it's tempting to slip into some kind of emergency mode of adopting reactive measures and reactive policies. And I would like to stress that we must not lose the focus on addressing the conditions that cause the crises. Human rights are a powerful tool to counter political pressures for that quick fix. In the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, as well as his call to action for human rights are recognized as not only obligations, as we all know they are, but as providing solutions to complex problems. With 8 years to go, only 8 years until 2030, we need bold and urgent action with human rights at the center. So in that spirit and guided by our common agenda and the call to action, I wanted to just quickly highlight 5 critical areas. First, staggering inequality. Global inequalities are estimated to be as great today as they were in the early 20th century. More than 263 million people may be pushed into extreme poverty this year because of the combined effects of COVID-19 and increased food prices. Gender inequality is also rising. Women remain less paid, but more likely to be unemployed than men, and are overrepresented in informal and vulnerable employment, but underrepresented at all levels of political leadership. So addressing inequalities and discrimination is at the core of our work. In Guinea-Bissau, together with UN Resident Coordinator's Office, we have supported the government in organizing regional consultations to ensure that voices of the most disadvantaged were heard during the country's voluntary national review process, the first one that they've held. This is one example highlighted in the new guidance on human rights and VNRs, which we will launch tomorrow under the call to action for human rights workstream. Second, we need economies that invest in human rights. If national budgets allocate sufficient resources to economic and social rights for all, they can be a powerful lever for equality. We have OHCHR Surge Initiative, which supports countries in bringing economic and social rights into macroeconomic policies, recovery plans, and national strategies. We assist with budget analyses to help states create more fiscal space for economic and social rights. Third, we need greater international cooperation and solidarity. We have heard this, but we need to repeat it. It's not there at the level we need it. Significant boost in financial resources is needed. We know that to achieve the SDGs, including a strengthening of fiscal systems and a redoubling of efforts to reach the 0.7% ODA target. Debt payments in low and middle income countries can often crowd out spending on education, on healthcare, and social protection. So working in closer partnership with the international financial institutions is critical if development financing is to help states meet their human rights obligations. Fourth, we must protect the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Protecting the environment and human life from the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss is essential for reaching the vision of the 2030 Agenda. Along with other UN entities, OHCHR has increased its focus on climate justice. We actively supported the Human Rights Council's groundbreaking recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We welcome the Stockholm Plus 50 outcome calls for universal recognition and implementation of the right and stand ready to support member states in close cooperation with civil society, very importantly, as Martin stressed, regional organizations as well, and those most affected by environmental degradation. Finally, fifth, we must do our utmost to safeguard civic space. So I also finish on that note. The UN needs to strengthen the implementation of the system-wide guidance note on protection and promotion of civic space. We must do more to ensure that states protect human rights defenders and ensure freedom of assembly, association, and expression for everyone. We support human rights defenders' networks across the world, and safe and enabling civic space continues to be a priority for the UN. And of course, OHCHR is always there as the voice to stand up for this. For all those reasons, the Sustainable Recovery Pledge is more relevant than ever. We call for leadership in recommitting to the SDGs and in placing human rights at the heart of recovery to build resilience and leave no one behind. So with that, I wish you all a very fruitful and important discussion today, and I look forward to hearing all of you and your interventions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Good. We have a computer crashing with Klaus.
Do you wanna? Can I speak? I can speak anyway. Sorry, but my screen is entirely black, so if I'm a bit disorientated right now, that's the reason why. We'll finish or fix it as soon as possible. But thank you very much also for those remarks, and also for slicing up the challenges so nicely into very into sub challenges that are comprehensive but easy to understand your analysis there. Thank you so much. Now it's over to our panelists, which are part of setting the stage and talking a little bit about what the concrete, or giving some examples of what the concrete challenges are. In a few seconds, we'll hear from the permanent representative of Guatemala to the United Nations in New York, His Excellency Ambassador Luis Antonio Lampadilla. And Your Excellency, Guatemala presented its third voluntary national review last year in the midst of the pandemic. Could you share two of the best practices that your government undertook to address the pandemic? Over to you.
Thank you, Klaus, for giving me the floor. I want to thank the permanent mission of Denmark for the invitation to be part of this event, as well as the Danish Institute for Human Rights and the panelists, my dear colleague Martin, and the ASG for Human Rights, Ms. Brands, for their valuable contributions. In the current scenario where the COVID-19 has left innumerable lessons for all countries, the need to work together to promote a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery is more relevant than ever. The pandemic has shown that the convergence of all actors, integrating efforts and resources, generates greater impacts, mainly in the development goals, that constitute an essential requirement to prevent future crises that may put in risk the achievements already made. It is important to remember that the measures to contain and mitigate the pandemic changed the way in which governments implemented their strategies that are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and particularly the goals, targets, and indicators prioritized by each country. In the case of my country, Guatemala, since the beginning of the pandemic, there was a vision with a prospective approach aiming at the economic and social protection of individuals and their families, as well as a focus on the recovery of the country, implementing the economic reactivation plan that have guided the efforts of each sector. However, the impacts of this crisis have become more evident in sectors such as education and health, limiting the access to preventive healthcare. Likewise, food security has been compromised, requiring greater welfare interventions, given that the loss of the economic income due to the reduction of jobs or the loss of family members increased poverty, especially for the most vulnerable. Additionally, the effects of climate change and extreme weather events are being suffered by the most vulnerable groups, as women, children, youth, older persons, indigenous peoples in my country that are a great majority, and persons with disabilities, generating also human mobility. For this reason, Guatemala has emphasized the need for a social just transition that is able to balance economic and environmental interventions, keeping the human being as the center of the efforts. In this line, Guatemala, though its representation in Geneva, has also joined the Sustainable Recovery Pledge presented by Denmark. Colleagues, Guatemala is honored of having presented its third voluntary national review last year in 2021, highlighting that our country was one of the first to incorporate the SDGs into the national planning instruments, defining 10 national development priorities that have allowed us to adapt the SDGs to our national context. For that reason, in a very brief intervention, I just would like to give the floor to the Director of Public Management for Development of the Secretariat of Planning and Programming of our country, Araceli De Leon, who has been part of the team in charge of preparing our BNR. She will share details about how we can incorporate a human rights approach and the participation of multiple sectors of the society in our consultation process, as well as in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in Guatemala, if that is okay.
That's very welcome, but please keep it brief as well, so we have time for also the panel discussion after that. But thank you, it's a very interesting perspective as well. So over to your colleague.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Pues bien, tal cual explicaba el embajador, muchas gracias por cederme la palabra. Definitivamente, el año pasado presentamos nuestro tercer informe de revisión nacional voluntario y definitivamente, al igual que los informes anteriores, nuestros informes han sido participativos. Muestra de ello es de que en nuestras 10 prioridades, la cual pues fue internalizada en los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, obviamente las poblaciones vulnerables son nuestro punto de atención. Como muestra de ello, tenemos una prioridad que se denomina protección social, reducción de la pobreza y protección social, en la cual pues podemos identificar que tenemos metas específicas para las mujeres, para los jóvenes, para la protección de la niñez. Y un dato muy importante, las estadísticas muestran que tuvimos un avance en ocupación de mujeres en espacios tanto públicos como políticos. Yo considero que ese es un paso muy importante. También tuvimos un avance en la meta de inclusión de los jóvenes que no trabajan y que no estudian y que se les ha dado oportunidades. Contarles también de que tuvimos una serie de talleres, si bien es cierto, reconocemos que nuestras poblaciones vulnerables no son actores de que deben de darle cumplimiento a la gente, sino que son agentes de derecho, y por lo mismo reconocemos este espacio en nuestros procesos y han sido participativos. Hemos tenido talleres con las poblaciones vulnerables y justamente nos encontramos en una fase de cara a elaborar el cuarto informe de revisión nacional voluntaria y hemos tenido una serie de talleres con poblaciones indígenas, con juventud, con personas con discapacidad. Estamos próximos a tener un evento con niñez, porque consideramos que las voces de nuestros niños son importantes. Es importante reconocer que como actores de derechos deben también conocer qué está haciendo el país y cómo estamos abordando los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Bien, no quisiera ampliar más y invitarlos a que sean parte de estos procesos y que nos puedan acompañar a elaborar nuestro cuarto informe de revisión nacional voluntaria. Muchas gracias.
Very much for an additional, very interesting perspective. Can you hear? Sorry, Mr. Ambassador, you were saying?
No, I just want to say thank you again, and thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward for the conversation and discussion.
Yeah, but thank you very much to you, Guatemala, and thanks for the effort that you're putting into this with signing or joining the pledge here. Now, for a perspective from a different part of the world, Luxembourg. We have the Deputy Permanent Representative of Luxembourg to the UN office in Geneva, His Excellency Luc Dockendorf. Luxembourg is presenting its second voluntary national review at this year's HLPF. Could you please reflect on the COVID-19 recovery journey that Luxembourg undertook, and what are the two main lessons learned or best practices to highlight from it? Over to you, and thank you for joining this.
Thank you very much indeed, Klaus, and our thanks to the Danish Institute for Human Rights and Denmark at the UN, and of course also the Universal Rights Group, and our colleagues from Guatemala for sharing their experience here. As you've said, we are at our second voluntary national review that's being presented these days to the HLPF. I'm sure it'll be online at some point, so you can I'll send the link around and everybody can look into it in a bit more detail. But I think in the interest of time, I can be quite brief when it comes to our COVID journey. It's not at the end. I think one of the big errors in judgment that we have made collectively is that we believe that the pandemic was over long before it is actually over. So we need to redouble and keep our efforts at a very high level to make sure that as the SDGs demand from us, nobody is left behind. Luxembourg, very briefly, has been quite lucky for a number of reasons. On the one hand, we're a very wealthy country. We are very small, so the problems that most other countries have, we have on a much smaller scale. We live in a very peaceful part of the world, and we have an economy that is very much services oriented, both in finance and in technology. And so the potential for teleworking was very high for us. So switching when the pandemic really hit to working from home was, I mean, it was difficult for a lot of people, but overall, and especially compared to the experiences of practically most of the rest of humanity, we had an easy ride. That doesn't mean to say that there wasn't human suffering at a very high level. There were, in terms of percentage, we occasionally ranked among the higher percentage of population that got sick and died. But essentially, the economy recovered fairly quickly. We had the lowest rate of well, generally, when you look at the macroeconomic indicators, the lowest recession rate in all of the European Union, and managed to catch up quite quickly afterwards. But again, the lessons we draw from this, and all of that is in the voluntary national review paper that's been prepared for the HLPF, is that you need to take seriously the what it says in Agenda 2030, which is that if you want to succeed as a society, you can leave nobody behind, and you need to make sure that you get the fighting in economic inequality right, as much as you get presenting everybody with equal opportunities and supporting those who are either historically or for other reasons marginalized as much as they need to be supported. So leave no one behind, of course, is that first part, and there's a number of there were a couple of economic packages that the government presented to support small and medium enterprises, but also parents with children and single parents and people from a migration background and so on and so forth. So that's the one part. Really make sure that you give yourself, if you have them, the means to claw yourself out of the hole that the pandemic brought you in. And the second is be open to learn from others, and also be open to criticism, to introspection, learn from not just your immediate neighbors, but also from the rest of the world, which is why we welcome so much the possibility of sharing our experiences in the voluntary national review and hearing from others as well, because we by no means want to pretend that we have all gotten everything right, and we have still a very high level of inequality in our society, and other worries that we look to the UN, to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to all the various mechanisms we have, both to protect human rights, but also to further highest standards of living for everybody around the world, to learn from them. And then, of course, it is very valuable for us to hear both from friendly partners like Guatemala, but also from non-state actors. And both the Danish ambassador and Ilse Brands-Keris mentioned the importance of civic space, and I think that is here absolutely essential as well, because they keep us honest, as it were. Thank you.
And thank you very much to you for that last very important point about civic space. Much appreciated, to remember to include that in sort of the partnership which this pledge is also centered around. Now, for a different perspective, we will turn to the special representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, and that's Ms. Mami Mitsutori. And to you, in May, the 7th session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction took place in Bali. Could you speak to the importance of human rights-based and gender-responsive approaches to disaster recovery, which are some of the main outcomes of the session? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues. So it's really a great pleasure to join this important discussion on what should happen on the ground. My organization, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we have been championing Building Back Better for a long time, even from before the pandemic. Many of you may not know that actually this expression was created by the disaster risk reduction community. So in 2015, when all member states unanimously adopted the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, one of the 4 priorities of this people-centered, human rights-based documents was to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. At its core, it is about eliminating conditions that lead to a disaster in the first place, wrecking lives and livelihoods. And we are talking about inequality, poverty, marginalizations, which are root causes that drive up vulnerability to risk. So any recovery effort from any kind of disaster, they must address these conditions. Now, the importance of human rights-based and gender-responsive approach to disaster risk reduction and disaster recovery resonated widely at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Bali, convened by UNDRR and hosted by the government of Indonesia a little over a month ago. And it does feature prominently in the outcome document of the conference, which is called the Bali Agenda for Resilience. And actually, it goes back to 2015, because as in all global agenda documents adopted that year, the Sendai Framework makes leaving no one behind a core principle. We know that without conscious and concerted attention to reducing vulnerability to future crises, through making the recovery process truly risk-informed, marginalized groups will be left further behind. Poor people will become poorer, informal business will never resume, girls who lose opportunity to education will on top of that become child brides. We have seen all this happening during the pandemic, from which we are trying to recover, and also as a result of climate emergency. So truly and really, the time to act on an inclusive approach for disaster risk reduction is now. So what do we need to do on the ground and at the country level? First, we must acknowledge that disasters affect everyone, but differently. Member states must advance a participatory, inclusive approach to disaster risk reduction planning and implementation, what the Danish ambassador said about making them agents of change. Countries must ensure that interests and needs of the most at-risk countries, at-risk groups, are reflected in the planning. And if governments want to have a human rights-based disaster risk reduction strategy, countries need to make it a norm, not an exception, to include the representatives of vulnerable groups in the making of recovery plans. Second, and in relation to the first point, and also mentioned by many already, it is critical to strengthen gender equality and participation of women and girls in decision-making. We know that women and girls face specific vulnerabilities in time of disasters because of pervasive gender inequality and biases that exist across all societies. Policies and programs for DIHR must be based on an understanding of the gender dimension of disasters. Also, women need to be brought in as leaders for planning and implementing policies. And this is why last year we launched in Asia Pacific our Women's Leadership in Disaster Risk Reduction, otherwise known as WIN-DRR program, which is actually about promoting women's leadership in disaster risk reduction and creating a network for these women. Third, countries cannot wait for a disaster to happen to adopt an inclusive recovery plan. Planning for recovery and rehabilitation before a disaster strikes, this is the best way to ensure that recovery from a disaster is based on policies and financial mechanisms that lead to long-term resilience. I'm sure this does not sound challenging for anyone because sadly, now for all countries, the matter of disasters happening is not an if, it's a when. Last but not least, reducing disaster risk is essential to achieving the SDGs. Nothing erodes sustainable development like a disaster. The implementation of the Sendai framework is crucial for achieving SDGs so that no one is left behind. In working towards a sustainable future, we must commit to use recovery from this pandemic and many other crises as an opportunity to ingrain a prevention-oriented, risk-informed, whole-of-society approach into development trajectories. We talk many times about changing a tragedy into an opportunity. We can do this if governments and all of us take this opportunity to build back better and rewrite the story of exclusion and marginalization. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you with some important messages also about proactiveness and inclusion in these processes. I think that's from our side is also very key to what we're trying to support from our side. Now from a different perspective, moving over to the civil society perspective, we will hear from the Human Rights Advisor for the Human Rights Council and the International Disability Alliance, Jared Klein. And Jared Klein, during the pandemic, we have heard about how COVID-19 exacerbated inequalities and hit hardest people who have already been disadvantaged or marginalized. Recovery policies and strategies did not always succeed in addressing the needs of specific populations in a targeted way. What are some of the success stories you know about from working with people with disabilities? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you to the organizers and co-sponsors of the event. Firstly, I'd like to say that the Sustainable Recovery pledges for organizations of persons with disabilities, a very important way in which political momentum can be built and sustained. Of course, the CRPD is at the core of all our work, but it is not self-executing. It requires renewal of political commitment, and we have seen some good progress in this regard. There are 5 areas I'll try and very briefly touch upon, and we've seen positive steps from many of those members, those supporters of the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, and from others as well. The first is in accessibility. Of course, accessibility is an enabling right. It's fundamental, and particularly in relation to health services. There have been some excellent telehealth standards developed by the WHO and ITU, and many states have started implementing them, and this will significantly help persons with disabilities when, unfortunately not if, a new similar crisis arises. And the second is attitudes of the general population and also of healthcare workers. We noticed at an early stage of the COVID pandemic, there were some very negative perceptions about persons with disabilities, but fortunately through the pandemic and afterwards, there have been considerable changes in this, particularly of health workers, because they are at the front line. The third is on engagement and participation. This means including organizations of persons with disabilities in recovery plans, and this has happened in a great number of countries now. Also prior, but we've seen a significant increase, and this really is fundamental to have those representative organizations included so that decisions aren't made for or about persons with disabilities. They're made in consultation, meaningful consultation with persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. And in several countries, including those in the Asia Pacific, there's been an increase in resources and funding for organizations of persons with disabilities. We know that's not easy. in times of fiscal constraint. It is not an easy thing to do, but it really does help significantly. So we're grateful for that concrete measure in which civic space can be strengthened even in these difficult times. Finally, my fourth point on institutionalization, that was a significant barrier and problem. Really during the pandemic, everyone suffered from a kind of lack of community inclusion, from exclusion and isolation, which is commonly an experience of persons with disabilities across the world due to their impairment. We've seen slow but steady increase in political support for deinstitutionalization measures, ensuring that support services and all services for persons with disabilities will be community-based. We're conscious that is a very long-term goal, but it is an obligation of the Convention, and we do feel somewhat optimistic in that in the coming years there will be a transformation of service delivery for persons with disabilities based on the signs we've seen so far. Finally, the point made by the Ambassador of Denmark at the start on social protection, that really, of course, is also fundamental. We know, again, how difficult that is, but disability-specific support payments and support services made separate from other forms of social protection so that the cost of one's impairment is not borne by the individual or the family alone is extremely impactful. And there's been some slow, again, we don't want to overstate the change, but again, some significant steps in that regard. And just finally, there's an example from New Zealand. Somewhat recently, they established a ministry, a government department exclusively dedicated for the rights of persons with disabilities, and we consider that a good practice. It won't fit for all countries, but it really is a way of integrating the rights of persons with disabilities in everything that a government does. So with that said, like others, we're concerned about the future, but it pays to be optimistic and have hope, and indeed the Sustainable Recovery Pledge does give us that hope, as do the practices so far. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Jared. Final opening statement from the panel is from the Arab States organizing partner of the Women's Major Group, Ms. Shaima Abdelmajid. Welcome to you. We know too well that women and girls in their diversity have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in multiple ways. Are you aware of any recovery measures in the region you work in that address the specific needs and challenges faced by women and girls? Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Klaus. My name is Shaima Ali and Abdelmajid, and I'm the organizing partner of UN Women Major Group for Middle East and North Africa. Just firstly, I would like to highlight that Middle East and North Africa region, where I work, including, of course, the GCC countries, have been hit hard as all regions by COVID-19 and its social and economic implications. We witnessed the escalation of violence against women and girls in our region and severe economic implications. Despite varying levels of health system preparedness across the region, Middle East and North Africa countries' overall health management strategies have proven to be efficient to curb the pandemic. Despite all the challenges and the shrinking civic spaces due to the COVID-19, which was taken as some reasons to restrict non-governmental organizations' movements in Middle East, however, governments have rapidly reacted to contain the coronavirus by developing massive policy and institutional plans, including, of course, addressing, of course, women also to support households and firms. In some countries, as in GCC countries, for instance, they have capitalized on their innovative policy efforts to improve inclusiveness, sustain welfare provisions, and promote structural reform agenda for more open, I would say, society, and tapping into the available sustainable development goals and Agenda 2030, which they adopted. The Middle East and North Africa economies made important efforts to address the COVID-19 health crisis early enough. However, in other fragile and conflict-affected countries, and I'm speaking here given that my background in Middle East and the protracted humanitarian context we have, as a COVID-19 outbreak posed a major challenge given the damages to health systems in emergency settings, as in Syria, for example, where availability of water, sanitation, and hygiene for women is scarce, especially for disadvantaged groups and young girls. Applying preventive measures to limit the spread of the disease has proved to be very difficult. Some countries in the region, as in Saudi Arabia, have developed a rapid situation analysis, which helped a lot to identify the damages caused by the pandemic to the small and medium enterprises and women-led micro enterprises specifically. Many governments in the region also adopted measures to ensure the continuity of the public services, for example, teleworking arrangements and online tools that helped women a lot to continue working as public servants. And they were developed really quickly to facilitate the ongoing functioning of public administration. Jordan and Morocco were very good examples for this because they developed the practical manuals on teleworking early enough at the outbreak, at the start of the outbreak of the pandemic. There is no question that the crisis has tested the public sector in our region, forcing governments at our countries to make quick decisions, make crisis coordination and implement drastic intersectoral measures, honestly speaking, to protect communities at risk. Many administrations, as in Egypt, for example, and Morocco, have demonstrated a strong capacity to mobilize prevention measures while preparing for stimulus packages to support households and firms. This crisis actually emphasizes the importance of underlying structural issues such as transparency and fight against corruption, which we, as women-led civil society organizations, have been calling for since long. Governments also in our region have made considerable efforts in their policy responses to address income and social protection gaps by reaching out to the most vulnerable households and households where women are breadwinners. Several countries have either topped up or expanded the coverage of their social assistance programs. For example, in Tunis, the Tunisian Ministry of Social Affairs collated its different programs of previous poverty programs and assistance and further made a call for people to come forward, especially women, to register for financial assistance. Several Middle East and North Africa countries have taken steps to integrate the specific needs of women in the COVID-19 response agenda. In Algeria, for example, just giving an instance, the Ministry of Women Affairs was actively involved alongside other ministries in the committees in charge of elaborating the crisis response to address women's needs. In Egypt, we have the National Council for Women, which monitors from a gender perspective all policy measures that have been undertaken by the government and has recently released the third edition of its Women Policy Tracker, which I can share with you later on if any attendant requests, on responsive policies and programs amid the COVID-19 pandemic and other upcoming potential pandemics. However, women in Middle East and North Africa are still lacking leadership roles in crisis response and the disaster risk reduction areas, for example. So we can also take part in such policies later on in case other pandemics hit or even any disasters or natural disasters in our region. Finally, while the current focus is rightly on addressing the immediate recovery measures caused by the COVID-19, the Middle East and North Africa governments should not undermine the action needed to limit the threats from climate change. Water scarcity, and especially in protracted humanitarian context, water and air pollution, soil degradation, and the desertification which we have. These threats also, if not taken into consideration seriously now, could destabilize our societies and economies in the post-COVID-19 era, especially if the women leadership will remain limited in these areas of work. Thank you so much for your attention. Over to you, Klaus.
Yeah, and thank you to you too, and thanks again to the panel for 5 very interesting and very diverse perspectives on this. Now, we've come to the part where we are opening up for discussions, and with approximately 40 minutes left in our plan, we've left 15 minutes at the end of this to also open to the floor of the participants here. So we're going to pose a few questions to the panel now, taking approximately 15 minutes. So we are going to be a bit more selective than we've done that, but exactly in order to ensure that there's also time to collect some questions for the floor. And as I said, your participants are welcome to post questions in the chat, and we will take as many as possible shortly or in the Q&A session afterwards. My good colleague Micah, she will try to curate that particular sessions. Because now we will zoom in on the sustainable recovery. And I think it would be interesting following on from the fact that one important takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic is that our future planning needs to be risk informed and grounded in human rights to be sustainable and leaving no one behind. So I would like to ask, for instance, starting with Guatemala, and hear from you. From your perspective, could you think of one concrete idea about how we can prepare for the future? Over to you.
Sí, muchas gracias. Considero que es una pregunta muy interesante, y partiendo de que Guatemala ya hizo un ejercicio de no solo planificar al 2030, sino que adaptamos nuestro plan nacional al 2032, en la cual contemplamos todas las necesidades y características de Guatemala en las 10 prioridades nacionales de desarrollo. Considero que una visión a futuro es poder unir no solo a la sociedad civil, al sector privado, al gobierno, a los gobiernos locales, e integrarnos a que trabajemos juntos en pro de cumplimiento de las prioridades nacionales de desarrollo de Guatemala para que podamos tener esa sostenibilidad que se requiere. Gracias.
And thank you to you for a very concise answer on that one. Could I try to pose the same questions to Luxembourg as well, thinking about one concrete action that can be taken in the immediate future when it comes to improving our planning around these issues?
Absolutely. Just a moment while I try to get the camera. Yes, it works. Wonderful. Well, concrete is the word that is supposed to do the heavy lifting, but that we are perhaps the weakest with. No, I think there's a number of things you have to do as governments, and the first is learn from your mistakes and learn from the past in order not to repeat the mistakes in the future. And if we look at all the things that went wrong, and very many things went wrong, although many things went right as well, we realize that very often we base our policy making not necessarily on the best available data, but rather on gut feelings, on things we think we know about the economy or about society, which turn out not to be entirely right. One of the priors that we have and that we have to challenge is that when disaster strikes, people panic and everything breaks down and so on and so forth, when the available evidence tells us that when things go badly wrong in the world, people help one another, people are there for one another, communities get together and they overcome the challenges. It's the elites that are the problem, because they panic and they try to impose law and order, and that normally goes very poorly in most societies. So I think if you want to do good planning, you need to, and that is perhaps the recommendation, you need to have a very solid analysis, understanding, and also ability to challenge existing power relations. And for that, of course, you need a solid understanding of your political economy, of how your society is structured, of international relations, of the state at which the world is at every moment. And one concrete way of getting that is not just to listen to the loudest voices, but make sure you overhear nobody from civil society, from marginalized, especially historically marginalized communities, women, of course, but also other people who normally get overheard. And that normally should allow you to have a better analysis and to actually, well, realize what is not working, because we have an endless number of plans for everything from the SDGs to the Sendai framework and global compacts for migration and refugees and the Paris Agreement and so on and so forth. What is broken is the politics that we have, and that I believe we can fix by listening to the people. And one approach, and I'll end on that. Concrete approach that the government of Luxembourg is trying to follow is, as we go towards trying to become carbon neutral by 2050, which is, if you ask me personally, is too far in the future. We will actually ask citizens. We'll put together by sortition a citizen committee, and everybody will get their say how they see this happening. And I think that's something that's proven its worth in many other contexts as well. If you rely on the ability of people to think critically and also to be humane, that's normally a good recipe for success.
But thank you very much for also being so concrete. And I think in general, it would be excellent that we get these best practices out as well about what has actually worked. For you, Jared Klein from the International Disability Alliance. I just maybe the same question to you, if there are sort of any concrete ideas about how to prepare for future crises, and of course very much taking into account the needs of persons with disabilities. Do you have a few ideas about that? Over
Sure.
to you.
Thank you so much. And I like very much what the colleague from Luxembourg said about not just listening to the loudest voices. I think that's very important and well put. Yeah, I mean, essentially, this does come down, of course, to resources, but also planning. Does the government have a process for consulting with and discussing plans with organizations of persons with disabilities, or are they an afterthought? Does the government have a comprehensive accessibility measures that cover all forms of disabilities, not just the larger groups? Does the government have special training for medical staff on how to sensitively handle rather and treat and care for and provide support for persons with disabilities or not? These are all things that are effectively the government can go step by step and consider if these pieces are in place or not, and then through discussing with organizations of persons with disabilities, are they fit for purpose? Essentially, it's just talking to the marginalized groups and listening to what they say, not to understate how much of a challenge and how much time and money that might take. But it's also not really rocket science. So we're very hopeful that the states can do that. Essentially, it's listen and then, to the extent possible, respond. And also, I will stress the provision of services in the community. Are you excluding persons with disabilities directly or indirectly from society or not? These are all things we can objectively analyze. So I hope that's concrete enough. Thank you.
Oh, that's very concrete. Thank you. Now, maybe from the UN perspective, Ms. Mitsutori, if you have any things you would like to request the states to do in order to prepare for these future crises, which are on the horizon and very visible in many ways. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the question. There are several things that we need to think about, and I would really want to encourage the states to think about. One, we need to localize our policies around, of course, disaster risk reduction, but anything, right? SDGs. Of course, the national government needs to have a strong framework of laws and regulations and structures, but the issues are happening in the communities. At the global platform in Bali, I heard so many times the word community coming up. People were saying we need community-based solutions. We need to empower the communities, and we also need to support the civil society, which helps these communities and operate in that area. And the other thing that I would say is that the countries, I know many of them are already doing it, but we need more disaggregated data around the vulnerabilities that we have. We talk about this a lot, and I think the data sometimes rests somewhere, and we need to be better in gathering them. The issue really about women and girls, but persons living with disability, indigenous people, and transform that data into policy. And lastly, I would say is that, of course, in order to make the recovery process as unchallenging as possible, we need to make sure that in the first instance, not many people are, less people as impacted by disasters. So let's think about early warning systems, which are really impactful for any kind of disaster. And the important thing about these early warning systems is that they need to be connected again to the ground, to the community, so that people know how to react to the early warning systems, early action, and it needs to cover what we call the last mile. So again, understand where the vulnerable people are so that the system reaches them. These are some things that we should do now, because COVID has really taught us that unless we focus on the local, the communities, empower the people, make them part of the solution, and have more disaggregated data, our policies, which the DPR of Luxembourg mentioned so eloquently, will not be effective. Over to you.
Yes, and thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning also the localization perspective, which permeates a lot of the international discussions for good reasons as well. So very good that you mentioned that. Thank you. I would like to pose to Ms. Abdelmajid also, if you can elaborate a little bit on if you have two priorities to address in the context of fighting inequalities in the context in which you work. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Klaus, for the question. Actually, I would think about the specific points that we have to consider. Firstly, I think the social protection nets, as I stated before, addressing women, elder women, and women with disabilities. If we talk about women in general, it's still insufficient. We need to address the needs of the most vulnerable women. And that have to be supported as a previous dignified speaker by disaggregated data and realistic statistics, and to address actually the needs of those who have been left behind so far in our communities. So we can work jointly and not in silos in order to address their needs. Because if we are talking about real equitable social protection policies, we have to disaggregate the population groups considered by these specific policies in place. Secondly, I would like to think about to fight inequality. There is a need to engage women in all policy-making levels, starting from design to implementation and the monitoring and the evaluation of these policies. If we need to have equitable policies for women, then we have to include them when we design these policies and the responses we adapt or the governments adapt. Either we talk about climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, healthcare and reproductive health policies, and protocols or economic recovery policies in general, and there's strategies in place for these reasons. Of course, women development as a capacity building strategies designed specifically for women is very critical, and to have such a human-centered based approach in policies implementation and design while giving the women sufficient equal opportunities in order to unleash their potentials, which are keys if we are talking about equitable post-COVID-19 recovery plans. Finally, I believe that the continuous engagement of civil society organizations and women-led civil society organizations and community-based groups in the reporting mechanisms placed by the United Nations, such as the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, and VNR, is quite critical in order to capture the reality in our communities and detect those gaps for further improvement. So these are just a few points I thought about. Thank you. Over to you, Klaus.
Thank you very much. And on my list of questions, which we would really like to pose to the panel, is once more to the UN and Ms. Mitsutori, and which you've touched upon aspects of it, but when states prepare for future disasters and shock, how should they ensure non-discrimination and equality? And why do you think that's particularly essential? But I mean, really focusing also on the what to do in order to ensure that this aspect is integrated, that particular aspect is integrated. Over to you.
Yes. We're always saying that we need to understand better what the risks are that are surrounding us and what they do to us. So very concretely, states need to have, and I'm going back now to the national level because it's very important what the national level do. They need to have rules-based but legally based structures in order to protect the most vulnerable people. It can't be just a policy that can change from time to time with probably the change of a government, right? I mean, of course, laws can be changed as well, we see it, but it's more powerful if there are laws that really embed the rights of these people and how they should be protected. And I think here the role of the parliamentarians is very important. We think that parliamentarians is a very strong, important stakeholder that needs to be brought in. I also believe that the role of media in what comes to how states plan and implement their policy is very important, because it's the media really in many instances, isn't it, along with the parliamentarians that ask for accountability of whether there are structures and financial mechanism tools in place, if they are implemented, if they are really focusing on the marginalized group, and take the government accountable. So I would say that the role of media and their independence is very important. And then again, I go back to the communities again, because marginalization, the real marginalization, unfortunately happens at the very end of the very localized, communities. So there you need to make the communities aware that they are the people who can own the dismarginalization, if there's a such word, of these issues. And what I'm trying to say is that it's about a whole of society approach, right? It's about partnership. The Sendai framework is based on the notion that, of course, the governments are in the center, in the driving seat of making policies around resilience and disaster risk reduction and prevention. But if it's not a whole of society approach, it doesn't work. So to give you a concrete example, in the Bali platform, 4,000 people came in person, 3,000 virtually, and it was a truly multi-stakeholder occasion with, I'm very proud to say, gender equality totally, the speakers, panelists, and moderators, 200 people in person from the community of persons living with disability. And you may not think it's a big, a number, but actually it is a big number when you think about, these people flown in with their caretakers, to have their voices represented. So I would say that one thing that, governments really need to do is to approach this issue about recovery as a whole of society issue, as an issue of enhanced partnership.
Thank you for a very elaborated answer, very interesting. Just I have the privilege now of one last question, and then I think it's important that we open the floor to capture some of the questions coming from the floor of this event as well. But just a final question to Guatemala, maybe, because one of the important aspects of this is to have an inclusive and representative decision-making around some of these processes relating to this. From Guatemala, do you have any good examples, best practice of how to work with representative decision-making in these processes? Over to you.
Gracias. Sí, correcto. Contarles un poquito cómo Guatemala tiene estructurada la toma de decisiones y en la cual pues está incorporada la sociedad civil. Y para eso tenemos el Consejo Nacional de Desarrollo Urbano y Rural, el cual pues cuenta con una representación de todos los sectores. ¿Y por qué en la toma de decisiones? ¿Dónde se van los presupuestos, el dinero de Guatemala? Pues resulta que en CONADUR hay un espacio para la sociedad civil que tiene representación de mujeres, de pueblos indígenas, de niñez, pero también hay representación de los alcaldes, ¿verdad? Que tienen su participación, una representación, ahí sí que son muestras representativas, ¿no? También tiene la representación del gobierno, de la cooperación internacional y del sector privado. Entonces, mediante CONADUR ahí se toman las decisiones en qué Guatemala debe de invertir. Entonces, obviamente, esa es la estructura que rige a Guatemala. CONADUR mandata, en este caso yo represento a CGPlan, la Secretaría de Planificación y Programación de la Presidencia, mandata a CGPlan que le dé ese seguimiento, no solo a la agenda nacional, sino que a la agenda internacional. Ya teníamos una agenda nacional, la cual denominada el Plan Catún, ¿verdad? Entonces, desde CGPlan le damos ese seguimiento. Bien, ¿cómo plasmamos estos dos instrumentos? Para nosotros son dos políticas muy importantes, como lo son CATUM y como lo son la Agenda 2030, los plasmamos a prioridades nacionales de desarrollo. ¿Cómo hacemos que esto cobre vida? Mediante la política general de gobierno. La verdad que nos sentimos orgullosos que este es el primer gobierno en Guatemala que le da seguimiento a la Agenda 2030. Hemos considerado que las 50 metas que tiene la política general de gobierno representa a todos los sectores. El día de hoy me acompaña la licenciada Marielos de Roda, representante de sociedad civil de personas con discapacidad, y la verdad que hemos trabajado muy de la mano y quisiera que ella nos contara también un poquito cómo desde, si bien es cierto, no hay una política nacional para personas con discapacidad, pero ella nos puede comentar, si me permiten cederle la palabra, que ella pueda contar qué estamos haciendo para representar pues a las poblaciones vulnerables.
Muchas gracias, muy buen día, distinguidos representantes, Marielos de Rueda, del Benemérito Comité Procesos y Soros de Guatemala, una institución privada y no lucrativa de la sociedad civil que trabaja fuertemente para lograr las alianzas, para que todos los determinantes motivos que nos unen para el cumplimiento de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible se logren implementar, en especial las recomendaciones que se dan a Guatemala en materia de derechos humanos. Coincidimos en que es importante esta alianza entre gobierno, iniciativa privada y sociedad civil para poder realizar este rescate después de la crisis del COVID-19 y que también se respeten y se aseguren los derechos humanos, en especial de los grupos más vulnerables, mujeres, niñez, personas con discapacidad, pueblos indígenas y en especial considerando en nuestra Guatemala que es un país multilingüe y pluricultural, con mucha población también en áreas rurales, y recordar que en Guatemala, según la última encuesta nacional en discapacidad del año 2016, un 10.2% de nuestra población, es decir, 1 millón. Muchas gracias.
This is perfect. Thank you very much for elaborating on that point as well. Now, on time, we have actually 10 to 15 minutes for my colleague Micah, who have gathered some of the questions from the floor. Thank you very much from my side to the panel so far for these interesting interventions and responses to some of the questions that we have. So over to you, Micah.
Thank you so much, Klaus, and thank you so much for the panelists. I was sitting here taking notes from all the rich contributions from your side. There are just a couple of questions in the chat. One is very specific, but I think we can kind of broaden it up. Asked by Francis, looking at specifically the Convention to protect the rights of people living with disabilities. And the question is if there's actually proof that having the convention is helping to protect the rights of people with disabilities in crisis. And I think we can make it a bit broader into our discussion and, you know, having specific human rights instruments out there. Does it protect people who are already, you know, marginalized or living in vulnerable situations? Does it protect them? So maybe we can start with Jared and then go around the table if colleagues have contributions from their side. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mika. And it's a great question. I guess the short answer is that, of course, there are continuous, ongoing violations of the rights of persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups, despite specific conventions and specific articles designed to ensure that states respect, protect, and fulfill their rights, which is why political commitments, renewal of political commitments through joint statements, through things like the Sustainable Recovery Pledge and others are very important, because otherwise implementation can fall by the wayside. That's not to undervalue the normative and practical impact of the convention itself. It has transformed the lives and the implementation of the rights of many persons with disabilities around the world, including through Article 11 on humanitarian situations. I'd say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition of rights protections. So it's really just the first step. Our work is ongoing, and I suppose will not end for some considerable time, but we must keep going. Thanks.
Many thanks. Are there any questions from our panel, reactions from other panelists to that question, since you are coming from different angles to the discussion? Luke, I can see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Yes, no, I think it's the answer has to be a very enthusiastic yes to the question. Sorry, I think it works better like this. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, like the rest of the vast corpus of human rights law that we have, gives legal tools to government, but also a platform to civil society to address specific human rights worries and to address the needs of populations who otherwise might have been marginalized. I mean, they might have been suppressed for centuries or marginalized in other ways. And you have the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which asks specific questions decisions of governments that have ratified the convention, and really holds them to account. It holds their feet to the fire every so many years, and then formulates very specific recommendations based on the actual needs of the country, which are normally formulated by, well, people with disabilities themselves, by civil society platforms that defend their interests. And I think that holds true for the entire spectrum of human rights. It's the same for CEDAW, against discrimination against women, the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, and so on and so forth. This is why we have human rights law, and it gives tools to the reform-minded people in governments, because I think they exist everywhere, but they do need the support also from an international body, like whether it is the Human Rights Council or a treaty body like the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and so on and so forth. And then the same, of course, goes also for things like Agenda 2030 or the Universal Periodic Review, and so on and so forth. What it always hinges on is whether the political will exists in countries to actually put their money where their mouth is, and actually make a positive change and leave no one behind. Because, and that again goes back to what I said earlier, and then I'll end on that. It is the issue that in so many places around the world, our politics is quite deeply broken, and there are struggles over power and over economic resources, and very often they are fought in a very dirty manner. And it's not the principle of the rule of law, where the law protects the weakest, but rather rule by law, where the powerful use the law to actually protect their privileges, and that's a huge problem.
Great, thanks so much, Luke. Special Representative Mizutori, go ahead. I can see your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I really wanted to endorse what was just mentioned by the DPR of Luxembourg. Yes, and enthusiasts, yes, because if we don't have these conventions, on what ground do you hold countries and governments accountable, right? But that's the most important thing. But second, and again, supporting what was mentioned, is that it has to be embedded in the rules of the national government, right? You know, if you subscribe to a convention, then it has to be the rule and law of your country. That's very important, because at the end of the day, it can only be held really accountable by national law in many instances. And thirdly, you need to put money into the implementation of that law, which goes back to what was mentioned a lot about social protection. A lot of policies are not implemented because the money, the budget is not put there. So yes, conventions, basically very important. They need to be supported by national laws and regulations. And three, you need to put the budget in protecting human rights. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for also bringing a bit of the context that is around the conventions and the systems that we have, that it's not only on themselves that they can be, you know, operationalized, but there is need for more elements. And now, since we are running soon out of time, and I wanted to kind of go back to the pledge and making commitments, and also linking it to the high-level political forum, and you know, learning, peer learning, and kind of doing our homework, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights at the center. I wanted to ask our panelists to reflect on and maybe commit. What will you do after leaving the panel, and also throughout the HLPF and going forward? What will be the at least one step that you will take to implement the Sustainable Recovery Pledge, and to get us to the recovery in a sustainable way? Who will take the challenge first? Go ahead, Luke. Thank you.
Thanks very much. No, I mean, what will I do? Well, I suppose it's possibly an unsatisfactory answer, but I'll try and do my job as well as I can. And the next part of that job will be to go to the Human Rights Council, and we have voting days. We have 2 days of voting on resolutions coming up, and a number of the resolutions that are on the vote could actually represent, if they fail, could represent quite a serious step back in terms of the well, of the human rights that we are trying to protect, on the discrimination against women and girls, on sexual orientation and gender identity, on the fight against female genital mutilation. And there is across the board an attack against the most progressive parts of the human rights protection system, which is going on in Geneva, but also in New York and more importantly, in countries around the world, because again, authoritarian governments, but also democratic governments that have authoritarian tendencies, are trying to curtail rights and are trying to restrict civic space. And that's, of course, a huge risk for human beings who have their rights cut, which they are theirs by virtue of international law. But it's also a massive problem for the recovery that we're trying to put into place after COVID, and of course the realization of Agenda 2030. So continue fighting for the integrity of the human rights system, I think, is the main pledge to go away from this.
Awesome, thank you. Sharon, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you. Well, a final message is to have a unity between all the members and get actions together, and send a message of hope and unity for all the society. And that's how we can work together and find us together, finding solutions for the most vulnerable groups. And in this way, get union together and do not leave anyone behind, and find solutions for the most powerful, needed people, and encourage them to follow up and find the best in a world that we can share with peace and better opportunities for all of us, in special the most needed people. So that's the best practices that we can learn from this discussion panel, and also from this high-level political forum. Thanks a lot.
So much. Jared, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Obviously, it's easier from a civil society organization, but I think what we need is accountability through data and evidence gathering. So that applies both to good practices and in the areas where states fall short, because as other panelists have said, the frameworks do exist both internationally and domestically. It's just about continually monitoring and holding states accountable to their obligations and commitments. And it can be quite a time-consuming task, but it's necessary not just to point out failures, but to give us hope and show where successes have been generated as well.
Thank you. And now we have Special Representative Mizutori. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Micah. So we've already made gender equality a cross-cutting theme throughout the whole strategic framework of our organization. So definitely we will implement it. But the commitment I would make is that in my advocacy role, I will always advocate for the importance of putting people at the center of disaster risk reduction. I will also support countries to do this, and I will also sometimes make constructive critical assessments if this is not happening. Thank you.
Very much. And I guess from the Institute side, I can also say that we are collecting best practices on the implementation of the pledge, and we will be sharing this material with you in the autumn. So please keep an eye on that. So my role is now done. Klaus, over to you, and thanks so much.
Yes, but thank you, Micah. And I could see probably one of your former colleagues in the chat missing you from as a colleague, but thank you for expertly having joined the Institute and facilitated this last session. And in general, before I do my closing remarks, I just want to thank, it's been very pleasant to be part of this event today. I think it's been extremely focused, and I think it's been clearly communicated by all of you, both panelists and people asking questions. It's been hands-on, rich in examples, and I think that's made it very, very educational to be part of this today, genuinely. So thanks to you for that, and thanks also, of course, for our co-organizers in terms of this. But for closing remarks from our side at the Institute, first of all, the Sustainable Recovery Pledge marks the start of a journey of recovery We all know that. We all know that that's going to be a battle to get out of the grip of the pandemic, but also, as it was mentioned by one of the panelists, I think, I mean, the pandemic was one thing. Now we have a food, fuel, and climate crisis also to think about when it comes to think about recovery. I think that's very important. We want to thank the signatories for having done really hard work to address systemic injustices and to push for required transformation of our societies and economies, and that we know that more lies ahead, but having taken the first steps and starting to discuss it and making plans is really important here. And especially, of course, for states that need to continue to take action to realize the 10 action points in pledge and deliver on human rights, the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement commitments. So for the states that we know that this is a given task. For civil society, will continue to play a critical role in contributing to solutions, building democratic societies, and holding governments accountable for their commitments. And for human rights institutions and actors who can inform strategies and help monitor sustainable recovery response and recovery actions, not least. So as said, the undersigning states have pledged to report on their progress in realizing this pledge. The Danish Institute for Human Rights is collecting these best practices from signatory states and will be publishing the results of this mapping in the next few months. I think, Micah, you also mentioned this. And personally, I will look forward to seeing this because it will be a collection of best practices that can and should inspire us to make strategies that will take us forward to attain the goal that's been set out to do. So from this part of the Danish Institute for Human Rights, thank you very much to our panelists, to our co-hosts, and to everyone joining this event. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting afternoon for us as the Institute for Human Rights. So hope also that it's been mutually beneficial. Thank you very much and have a nice morning, continuation of morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're positioned right now. Thank you so much.